Hello again, everybody. This is Dan Clouser, and welcome back to the Journey of My Mother's Son podcast. I'm joined with George Hutton, who's an author, entrepreneur, business owner, and so much more. And we'll talk a lot about that so much more throughout the conversation here. George, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's great to be here.
Really looking forward to the conversation. But before we get started, just introduce yourself to the listeners. Who is George today?
Well, listeners, today George is someone who writes books on self-development and coaches people on how to do better in their life. Everybody has a never-ending collection of desires and wants and needs that we essentially have to spend our life fulfilling. And those desires and wants and needs come associated with a lot of inhibitions and anxieties about how we can get that stuff done. A very popular phrase is that most people live lives of quiet desperation because we have these desires inside. We want to achieve those desires, but when you think about achieving those desires, we have a lot of internal inhibitions and anxiety. So I help people go after what they want and uncover or go around their own kind of internal obstacles that they have. And that's a very, very rewarding process for me. I learned a long time ago that one of my greatest pleasures in life is watching people go through the process of starting off and not thinking that they can do something and then realizing how easily they can actually do that thing that they wanted to do. And I learned that a long time ago while I was teaching, and it's just something that's carried me through. I am always curious about human nature, the structure of human decision making, the economics of human decision making, and all the kind of internal obstacles that are similar from person to person. And because we never really talk very much about our own internal struggles, we have this idea that our internal struggles are kind of unique to us, when in reality they're the same struggles that everybody faces. And just understanding that can help us kind of push through those internal obstacles to get what we want in life. And so that's kind of what I do, is I help people do those things. And the area in which I help people do that the most is usually in business or in sales or any kind of persuasive communication, because I'm not sure who said this, but no man is an island. It's very hard to succeed in life if you don't interact with other people. And the better that you can interact with other people, the more you can share your goals and find out common goals that they might have, the better you can create teams to help you go after your goals together with other people. And so building relationships and going after your own goals are kind of two sides of the same coin, so to speak.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that fact that no man's an island, because it's so true. You hear a lot of times people say, oh, this guy here, he's a self-made millionaire or self-made
Yeah,
this,
that's
self-made that. That's not the case. Like there's generally you know, one or a team of people behind that person that's helping
absolutely,
them get
absolutely,
to where they are. So I love
absolutely.
that. And I love what you're doing where, you're talking about overcoming our own inhibitions, because you know, we can all talk ourselves out of anything that we
Oh,
want to do,
absolutely.
even if it's our
Yeah.
greatest dream. I mean, when my wife and I set out on this, RV journey, selling our house and all that sort of stuff,
Hmm.
we could have talked ourselves out of that, in a hundred or a thousand different ways. There were so many
Yeah.
reasons, so many uncertainties as to what we were doing, but at some point, you just got to get out there, get to the edge of the cliff, and take that leap. So
Right.
what what is your process? When people are coming to you to kind of get them over that hump and overcome, because like I said, we can all come up with so many obstacles as why we shouldn't do something, but there's so many other reasons to do it, that
Mhm.
things that could go right when that decision's made. So like, what's your process when somebody's
Well, the first process is to understand that our brain, from an evolutionary psychology standpoint, is kind of created with a better safe than sorry outlook. Any kind of cavemen back in the day that would say, "Hey, let's take the leap and see what happens," those guys didn't exist very long. The people that were super safe and super careful, those are the people that existed. So the first step is to kind of realize that the inhibitions are really kind of an instinctive response. And we're living in a world that is far, far more complex than the one that we used to live in, than the one in which we evolved. And so the first step is to kind of help the customer or the client or the customer kind of look back in their past and do some work finding evidence that they have already succeeded in the same structural way that is similar to what they want to succeed. and kind of go slowly forward. And so there's a lot of careful calibration of backward looking memories and a lot of careful looking through what's going on a daily basis. And we can kill ourselves with our own confirmation bias. If you think you're going to fail, you'll find a lot of experience in your past where you failed. And if you think you're going to fail, you will only see that in the world. So the first step is to slowly recalibrate how they reference their memories. And even just kind of find small structures, very small examples of the kind of success they would like, and just purposely kind of create those to prove that yes, they can do this, and kind of step away from that instinctive mindset that says if you fail, you're going to die, because that's absolutely not true.
See, I think a lot of times, people have trouble really learning from their failures. That's
Yeah.
one of the things I think I've been gifted with. Prior to traveling full time in RV, my listeners know this. I'd coached baseball and softball for 30 years, and those
Mm-hmm.
are both games of failure. So
Absolutely,
I
absolutely.
always, taught our players, that there really was no failure. It was just there were
Mm-hmm.
lessons, and what do we
Mm-hmm.
learn from those mistakes? And I know you've done a lot of research on just the inner workings of the mind and all that stuff. And why is it so hard for people to you know focus so much on the failure itself as opposed to the lesson that came from that failure?
Well, learning from failure, I think, is instinctive, but usually only in physical activities, like you mentioned, softball and baseball. If you're practicing something, like if you're practicing the piano, you automatically learn from failure. You don't even think about that you're learning from failure. Every time you hit the wrong key at the wrong time, it sounds terrible, and you try to fix that. And so, learning from failure is natural. That the problem comes when we learn from failure in social settings, because our brain somehow is wired that when we meet a stranger and something bad happens, that can lead to disastrous results that we kind of overestimate have the probability of happening. Another problem with learning from failure in social situations is because we all have a very similarly structured childhood, where we're essentially trained that expressing our desires is dangerous, simply because by the time we're 3 years old, we've expressed our desires a million times, and probably most of those times we're told to shut up. And so, as adults, when we express our desires to a stranger, failure seems like we're getting punished by the gods, because that's what it seems like when we're 3 years old, and the adults are yelling at us because we don't know anything. We just know that these super powerful adults are giving us these angry responses in response to us expressing our desires. And so you can learn from failure, but it's something that you have to kind of consciously manage. We somehow instinctively learn from failure, like I said before, in physical activities like sports or playing an instrument, or your martial arts or something. But for some reason, in social situations, we need to consciously remember that everything we do is not going to be perfect. In fact, one of my favorite quotes is from Dale Carnegie, who said that every time you give a speech, there's actually three speeches. There's the speech you plan to give, there's the speech you actually gave, and then there's the speech you wish you would have given.
Yeah.
And so every kind of interaction with someone on a social setting, whether it's just a friendly conversation, or you're trying to get a phone number, or you're trying to sell something to somebody, that is always going to be true. You're never going to be 100%. You're always going to have an unfolding experience. And also, when it comes to learning from failure, as far as sports and music and whatnot, you're really operating in a very, very constrained set of rules. If you're practicing on piano, the piano is an inert object. The piano doesn't change its behavior every time you play the piano. But when you talk to other people, there's always a continuous unfolding of the unknown, that you don't know what's going to happen. You can even talk to the same person every single day and still be on that cutting edge of I don't know what's going to happen next.
Right.
And so there's always this sense of lack of control, where you're in a conversation, you just have to kind of try your best, not really knowing what the other person is going to say. And that's a kind of an uncomfortable situation for a lot of people. So it doesn't even belong in the category for most people of being in the area of I'm learning from my failures, or I'm learning from my experience. So it is something that we have to consciously manage. And unless you make the decision to consciously manage that, you're always going to feel like you're getting the crap beat out of you, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. So, George, what is it that led you down this work? 'Cause I know you've got a vast experience in other fields. So what was it that made you want to go down this road?
Well, it all started when I tried to become a copywriter. I thought the idea was fascinating, and I'm not going to lie, the idea of writing a good sales page and living the laptop lifestyle was very compelling to me. But the more I tried to persuade people through the written word, the more I started to study human psychology, and that really made me fascinated. When I was a kid, I was fascinated in science and how the world works, and that kind of shifted into my fascination of human psychology and the decisions that people make. And that kind of led me into economics and the economics of human decision making and the subjective economics of human decision making. So I just kind of combine my fascination with people, how they work, with an ability to use that and teach people how to live better lives, which gives me a great deal of satisfaction. So that's kind of a roundabout way of how I got to where I was. I didn't want to do this when I was a kid. I had no idea that I would be doing this when I grew up. It's just kind of something I kind of wandered into, and I'm in a very, very good place right now. So it's kind of a combination of what's been going on in the past, how I ended up to where I am. But it's a very fulfilling life that I have right now.
I love it. I love it. And in my intro, I mentioned that you're an author as well, and you've talked about you've written several self-help books, and you've even written some novels. You've actually written over 100 books, which I find absolutely amazing. I mean, I'm an author as well. I've just recently published my fourth book, and I can't even wrap my head around how you go out and publish 100 books. So yeah, tell me, like when aren't you writing? Like when we're done with this podcast, you're going to be right at it again, or like what? That's an amazing accomplishment of work, something you should be very proud of. But just tell me what that process is like. I mean, you've got to almost be constantly writing.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, to answer your question, if I'm going to be writing after this podcast, I actually got up this morning at 4 o'clock in the morning, which I do every day, and one of the first things I do is I write for at least half an hour. And there's been a couple of things that kind of made me into the kind of person that can write that often. And one of them was a piece of advice that I saw when I first started to write my very first novel. And that was to get rid of the idea of writing a certain number of words per day and just set a time per day where you write for a certain time per day at the same time every day. So I started doing that before going to work back when I was teaching English in Asia. And I just, it turned into a very, very comfortable habit, a very enjoyable habit. I just really like the idea of my brain and my ideas, my fingers, and watching the words come out. That's a very kind of pleasurable process for me. And this is next idea is similar to how when I believe it was Roger Bannister who broke the 4 minute mile. And then once he broke the 4 minute mile, everybody else was breaking the 4 minute mile. When you see somebody else doing something and you see, oh, they can do that, I can do that too. It was kind of like that. I was reading a documentary, or I was reading a book that was made into a documentary about Scientology of all things. And the guy who invented Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, before he invented Scientology, he just wrote tons of science fiction books. And the fact that it described this guy that would just set up his typewriter and just start writing and just pump out book after book, I thought, hey, I could probably do that too. Not that I wanted to be a Scientologist, but just the idea that it's possible to just write book after book after book. And at that point in my career, all I really knew about writing was these characters on TV that wander around with their laptops and they're waiting for inspiration and they write a little bit here and they write a little bit there. That's when I kind of solidified the idea that writing is just a daily habit that you do. And once you get into the daily habit of writing for an hour every morning, you're kicking out a couple, 3,000 words every single morning. And the time that I wrote all my novels, I was on this very, very fixed schedule where I would write every morning 4 chapters. Each chapter had to be 1,000 words, and that took me about an hour and a half every morning. And once I got into that schedule, I just kept going and going and going. It wasn't as far as what should I write about next or what can I do now. It was more like what book am I going to write when I get up and start writing tomorrow morning? What am I going to write about? So once I created that kind of hole in my head that every morning you have to write about something, that just sent a signal to my brain, so to speak, to come up with ideas to put into that hole that I would have every morning.
Yeah,
So it was really just creating this habit of writing every day, no matter what.
I love that. It's very interesting because I know Ernest Hemingway was the same way, and I think he would actually carve out 4 hours a day. I think
Yeah,
he would get up at 6 a.m. and basically write till 10 a.m. and then
yeah,
go about his day. And it's something that when I first heard that about Hemingway, I was like, you know, one of the things that came to my mind first is, how do you deal with writer's block? Like when you're kind of putting out that, or do you ever, I mean, because I know there's times where I'll sit in front of the computer and just, stare at it and not be able to write. I mean, how do you deal with that? Or is it something that, you've been blessed to not have to deal with? Because if you are, man, I want to know what you're doing there.
Well, for me at least, I think the issue with writer's block is, for me at least, it goes away once you train yourself to write every day, no matter what. You just start writing. And I think Hemingway is the guy that said, write drunk, edit sober. And so sometimes I'll have a tough time starting, but because I'm in the habit of writing, maybe the first 500 words will be utter crap and I'll later cut them out. But it's just to get the process going. It's kind of like exercising. If you're in the habit of exercising every day, you're not going to not exercise because you don't feel it. You're going to maybe jog really slowly for the first mile or two, but once you get into it, then you'll have a good exercise session. So sometimes it does take me a little bit to get that crap out of the way and start writing some good stuff, or at least good stuff according to what I think. But it's just, I just kind of just start writing no matter what. And it's usually, sometimes it's crap, but it kind of clears the kind of system out, unclogs the flow between the brain and the fingers, so to speak.
That's a very interesting way to approach it, where, so you do get that block, so to speak, but you just kind of write, even if it, like you said, you end up throwing it away, it at least gets you. Yeah, it's amazing the way you kind of equate it to exercise as well. It's your way of stretching, or your way of doing that soft warm up, so to speak,
Right, right.
even if it's something that doesn't get caps. That's pretty interesting way to look at it, for sure. Maybe something I may apply to my own
Yeah,
at this
yeah,
point,
give it
because
a
there are.
try, give it a try. Just tell yourself the first couple pages are gonna suck and just start writing whatever, blah, 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 blah. And then stuff will start flowing. You kind of got to prime the pump, so to speak.
Very interesting concept, for sure. So are you working on multiple projects at a time, or you're constantly working on that one book till it's finished, or you got a couple different things going on?
I usually have a few different things going on, and I schedule them in blocks during the day. So this day, this part of the morning is only on this particular book. This other part of the day is only for this particular thing. And I've kind of created a meta way to look at my schedule. So the night before I go to sleep, I map out my schedule for the next day. And during the day, I stick to that schedule no matter what. And when the time is up for working on the book, for example, I switch into the next project. And so I don't try to do a whole bunch of stuff at once. I just have these kind of blocks that kind of slowly add up to the next thing. And this block adds up to the next thing. And then they're done whenever they're done. But it's all on like a kind of a weird schedule, as if I'm a whole bunch of different people working on the different projects that are or different parts of the same project.
Right. So when did you publish your first book?
My very first book I published way back around, I'm going to say 2009, maybe 2010. It was before Kindle became a thing, and it was the very first fiction book that I wrote, and it took me a year to write it, and I didn't know what I was doing, and it took me like maybe not a year to write it, but it was like maybe 6 months to write it, and then another 6 months to kind of go through and edit it, and it was kind of a clunky kind of thing. But the more I did, the more I got it into the process.
Yeah,
Just
that's
like
amazing.
anything else, the more you do it, the better you get at it.
Right. Yeah, and so over 14 years, the fact that you've published over 100 books is quite amazing, to say the least. So, yeah, I can't, like I said, I can't even wrap my head around that type of production, so to speak.
Well,
So,
I don't have much of a social life. But I love to write. I love the process of writing. And in fact, this is going to sound really strange, but for about a year and a half, I was on a schedule of writing a novel every 2 weeks.
wow.
And I had the schedule I would write for. It was based on this kind of template that was based on the hero's journey from Joseph Campbell. And when I wrote, I kind of consciously created this kind of self hypnosis that I would hypnotize myself so that I wasn't writing. So I wasn't trying to think about what to happen next. So I would kind of imagine that as I was writing, I was watching stuff like I was watching Netflix. And usually it took me about 1.5 chapters to get into that. But once I got into that mindset, once I kind of warmed up my fingers and my brain, that connection, it was really just like watching stuff unfold. And this is when I had this really strange experience when I would go through my daily schedule. I would write in the morning, I would go to work, and then after work, I would go to the local library and kind of game out my next couple of books, just kind of put down some ideas. But while I was walking around town, I had this really strange experience. If you can remember back being a kid in school, back before streaming and before cable TV, when you liked the TV show and you go to school and you talk to the kids about what's going to happen next week when the TV show comes on, you have to wait and see what's going to happen. It was kind of like that. And that I would be wandering around town thinking about this unfolding story and these characters in this book that I was writing, but I would have this orientation towards this kind of collection of ideas and characters as if it was kind of separate from me. And I kind of had that idea of like what's going to happen next in this story that I'm kind of watching when actually I'm actually writing the story. So it was a really weird kind of psychological effect that I did on myself while I was writing these books. But it was a very, very pleasant experience.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. So you said that, you've always kind of written, and I'm the same way. I mean, I you know wrote my entire life, and then probably my 40s when I really had the desire to become a published author at that point, and published my first book in 2012. Um, so at what point did you kind of make that decision, um, from being just a writer to an actual published author? And what were some of those mental obstacles you had to overcome that now you're using in your coaching to help other people kind of take that leap? Because the same thing with writing. I mean, you got to, at one point, you got to take that leap and say, all right, I'm gonna dig down and actually write a book this time.
Well, I don't really remember having any kind of huge obstacles. When I transitioned from copywriting to writing books, it was really more of the same in my mind. When you write a sales letter for somebody, they tell you what they want, you write the letter, they check it, they approve it, then they pay you. And I thought this was kind of more the same thing. And I had a kind of an entrepreneurial attitude toward it, where writing books was just another way to make a product that you'd sell to people and hopefully make some money. And so I never really thought of it in terms of this big kind of obstacle that you're writing a book and now you're published and now this is really important. It was more kind of just more of the same thing as the way I thought of it.
Yeah, at the end of the day, really, a book is, essentially a bunch of blogs put together, when you really
Yeah,
break it
yeah.
down.
Well,
So,
the way I think about a book is just another product that you're trying to get people to buy and earn a living from. You could sell hot dogs. You could sell your services as a doctor or a plumber. You could sell copywriting, or you could write books and sell books to people. It's just another of the same process of creating something, putting it on the marketplace, and hoping that people buy it.
yeah,
The fact that it's a book is, I really didn't really think of it in terms of such big lofty ideas like, oh, no, I'm an author. Oh my gosh, I'm special or anything like that. It was just another thing that I did to hopefully earn a living.
gotcha. So, so how do you go about, like, what are some of the avenues that you're using, to sell your books?
Well, I gotta be honest. I love writing. I love coming up with ideas, but I'm not really that interested in marketing. And so as I've started my website a long, long time ago, your sound I think just cut out.
I said, I
Oh,
think most authors fall into that same trap
yeah.
where
And
they love
I've
writing, they don't love marketing.
right. I've been lucky enough to have my website for so long that's been passively collecting signups to my email list. And so whenever I wrote a new book, I would just sell it to my email list, and that was enough. In fact, in the past maybe 3 or 4 months, I've made a conscious transition. I've stopped creating products, and now I'm transitioning into only actively marketing the products that I already have. I've been creating products and ebooks and programs and self-study courses and audio coaching courses for probably about 10 years now. And I would just make the product and then passively grow the email list. And when I had a new product ready, when I had a new book ready, I would just sell it to my email list, and that would be enough. But I've really kind of run out of ideas. And so I'm trying to think in terms of how I can now get into marketing and use marketing to sell my existing books, which is not the same thing, because it's a lot easier to sell new products to existing customers than it is to sell existing products to new customers. And so
Very
that's
true.
kind of the transition I'm in right now.
Yeah, very, very true. So, George, is there anything that we missed during the conversation that you think would be valuable to the listeners to talk about?
Well, I think I want to get back to that statement I referenced earlier where I said most people live lives of quiet desperation. I don't know who actually said that. I think Thoreau said that. But it's also related to what Socrates said, is that the unexamined life is not worth living. If you live, and I do a lot in hypnosis and teach people how to use a certain kind of hypnosis during conversations and sales, but the worst, most insidious kind of hypnosis is the kind of hypnotic state that everybody is in most of the time. If you just kind of show up and live your life on autopilot, the chances are you're not going to end in a very happy place. For a while, it was possible, at least in the American economy after World War II. If you just kind of showed up and followed your autopilot instincts, you could maybe end up in a pretty good place. But that's not nearly as true as it used to be, and it's very dangerous. And so I think it's very critical that people at least spend a little bit of time examining their decisions, examining whether or not they really can achieve their goals or not, and kind of think about what they're doing and think about the influences that are getting into their mind, and kind of compelling them or not compelling them to do these things. Because it's very easy, like you said, to talk ourselves out of doing something when we probably should just try it and see.
Yeah, and I
So
love
if I
that.
had if I
What's
had a message to everybody, is just when that voice in your head says you can't do it, tell that voice to shut the F up and try it anyways. You'll be surprised. I mean, Mark Twain said that 90% of his fears never came true. And so just make the assumption that that voice is wrong most of the time,
yeah,
and just ignore it and blast away anyways.
yeah, absolutely, and so true. I mean, even with the lifestyle that we're living, um, I had loved what I'd done for the previous 30 years. Working in sports and working with kids, um, and I was definitely fearful about flipping the page and starting a new chapter. But
Right.
now that we're in it, 3.5 years, like it's just what we've discovered um, is just so amazing. And it's like
Mm.
when you think back and be like, what we were kind of content with the status quo. And,
Yeah.
and I think
Yeah.
society teaches us that. And like you said, it's so much more difficult. Um, you know, you mentioned post World War II, like you could kind of sleepwalk through it and be okay. Society still tells us to sleepwalk through it.
Right.
But
Right.
but like you said, most times you're not going to be okay at the end. Like there's just so
Right.
much more. And it's like just they're constantly telling do like there's this one path to happiness, and that's just not the case. Like there are so many
Yeah.
different paths, and it might not be sell all your stuff and jump in an RV and travel around the country for everyone. It's not that for everyone. It was that for us. And I think everyone's got to find their own um path to that happiness and achievement for
Hmm.
sure. And I love
Yeah.
the fact that you're helping people overcome those fears
Yeah.
to get to that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. If, like the poem says, you take the road less traveled, and that will make all the difference.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt about it. So, George, how do people find you on the internet if they want to reach out to you for any of your coaching services, if they want any of your books, any of your online courses? How do they find you?
We have one web page that lists all of our stuff. It's mindpersuasion.com/start. Mind Persuasion, one word, mindpersuasion.com/start. And you can see a list of all of our products, all of our contact information, coaching services, books, programs, subliminal programming, whatever you need. It's all on that page. Mindpersuasion.com/start.
Very cool. Very cool. So, George, that brings us to our final question. As you know, the subtitle of the podcast is Many Little People in Many Little Places, which comes from the
Right.
opening lyrics of a Michael Franti song, Gloria, which go, when many little people in many little places do many little things and the whole world changes. What's one of the little things that George does on a daily basis to make the world a little bit better place?
One thing I always strive to do on a daily basis is to go first. One of the lessons from, or one of the recommendations from Stoicism is, if you want to change the world, just act the way you wish other people would act
Right.
and lead from by example. And I've done that as often as I could, as long as I could. And that always shows people by example that going first is safe. Nothing's going to happen. I'm always the guy that volunteers to go first in speech class. I'm always the guy that goes first when there's a problem to say, hey, what's up? What should we do? And so I always look for opportunities to go first, just to be the guy that people can copy if they want to copy me, and lead by example, even in small, teeny tiny things.
I love that. I love that. That's awesome. So George, I really appreciated this conversation. A lot of informative stuff there that we talked about. I hope some people reach out to you and connect with you. For those out there listening, be sure to check out my other podcasts and blogs at journeymymotherson.com. While you're there, pick up a copy of one of my books. Again, George, I really appreciate the conversation. Listeners are going to get a lot out of this.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It was a great conversation.